Peter Carroll once described the way I write like this. He said, very often I begin with something which seems banal or a very trivial example, and from it I draw out some really quite interesting magical theories and ideas. And by the end, I'm really quite convincing. So I thought I would try out that formula on this time. Now, there's a saying that there are two types of people in the world. Those who think there are two types of people in the world and those who don't. Now, I'm definitely in the second camp, but I thought as my stupid statement, I would begin by saying, you know, there are two types of magician. Those who do magic to make life more interesting, and those who do magic to make life less interesting. Now there's a daft statement, and I hope some of you are thinking, what ridiculous, who on earth would want to make life less interesting? I've got you if you're thinking that, because of course I'm referring to what's supposed to be a traditional Chinese curse, which is, may you be reborn into interesting times. And of course this is an issue that I covered recently in two video talks. One was, I'm going to blow your mind, and the other is, did I blow your mind? And in that I played the role of the fictitious perfect magician who could solve people's problems by rewriting their stories. And I began with the book of Job, which is a really hard luck story of a man who was persecuted to the end, to destruction practically, by God. And I said that I rewrote it so that after the first persecution, God apologized and gave everything back and said it was just a test. And of course, Job loved it and his family loved it. But the thing is that if that had been the story of Job, would we still be talking about it thousands of years later? I think not. And the other example I gave is a James Bond Casino Royale, where I rewrote the thing so that James Bond wins his game and defeats the enemy right at the beginning of the novel, which raised the question that who would bother to read, let alone buy, a James Bond novel where the whole thing was solved in the first chapter? It just simply isn't interesting. And so I think you'll see now what I mean by those who want magic to make life less interesting. These are the people who want magic to give them the power to get rid of their problems and to reshape the world as they want it. Now that's a very reasonable thing to want to do, but it's sort of material for the skeptics who tend to dismiss magicians as weak people, who powerless people who desperately want to find a means of becoming powerful, and so they turn to the folly of magic. I talked about this at some length in a video which I think was called Magic and Power, where I really questioned, I was referring back to the time when everyone talked about empowerment as though empowering people was the most important thing. And I suggested that actually you could think of strength and power as complements. And there are many situations where people get more and more power and they become weaker and weaker because basically they cannot stand not having things their own way. They become really brittle. You know, an extreme example is of Adolf Hitler, where after a while people no longer dared tell him that his policies weren't working because he had the power just to have them dismissed or even assassinated if they did that. So I very much believe in magic as a way of living life more fully, making life more interesting. And I think it was rather well put in a recent Weird Studies thing, where they put it in terms of instead of avoiding problems, you're really engaging with life on a richer level. And there's a lot of that in my experience of magic and of people who've done magic for a long time. they actually find some of the problems, some of the demons are more interesting than just wanting to banish them. They want to form a relationship with their demons. Now, it relates a bit to the idea of karma. I think it was in Sosopome I wrote about, there was a time, maybe in the 90s, when there was some footballer or famous person let slip that he was interested in karma. And the sort of tabloid press leapt at this, you know, oh, what a weirdo, he's interested in this weird thing, what is karma? And they described it on the lines of, oh, karma is the belief that if you do bad things in this life, you'll be punished in the next life. Now, I wonder how true that is. And I'm not a great expert on karma, so I'd be interested to know what you think. But for me, karma is more about achieving balance or wholeness. And the sort of example I think of is, the person who's born into wealth. Rich parents, inherits wealth, never has to do anything to earn it, and lives a life of luxury and ease, not sort of thing. Now, I think that in his next life, he's liable to suffer poverty. But I don't see that as a punishment, because there's nothing wrong with being given wealth and living a life of luxury. Not so much punishment as a need to experience life more fully, because in that lifetime, he never experienced the very human conditions which include poverty and need and want. And so it's not so much to punish him as to take him towards a more whole experience of humanity, if that happens. I think the example I gave is, what of the sort of champion Olympic athlete who has an accident and dies at the height of his powers. He's 30 and fit and absolutely superb. I feel there's a chance that he might be reborn handicapped, not as punishment for being fit and everything, but because he hasn't had the full experience of growing old, being crippled, having limitations, and therefore he needs that. Now, you see, the interesting thing is that what if the rich man, instead of leading a life of total exclusive luxury, actually decides to help poor people? If he really goes into poor communities and really forms empathy with them and does a lot of good work to help them, even though he's still rich and probably able to live a comfortable life, I would say he's less likely to be born into extreme poverty. Not because he needs less punishment, but simply because if his work, he really got involved with poor people, he has vicariously had some experience of poverty and knowing what it's like. Okay, it's not the same as actually being poor, but I think it just means that he's balancing out slightly. And so that's how I tend to see karma, as a sort of balancing out. We incarnate in order to experience the fullness of human existence, and that includes quite a lot of negative things. And if in one lifetime we're lucky enough to avoid all those negatives, then we need to balance out by experiencing them on another occasion. So that just is another aspect of this thing of, do you want your life to be interesting, in other words, full, and be engaged with it, or would you rather it was a lot less interesting? Now, I said at the beginning I'm not into this thing of dividing things in two, and this is something I spoke about. I got a series of videos, a watch list, which is, I think it's Thoughts on Good and Evil. And the third one is what I call the analog model. And that is, I look at the number of times where there's a spectrum of difference and people arbitrarily split it in two. For example, left wing, right wing. Now, it's very useful to have that distinction, in many discussions and arguments. Oh, here's the left-wing view, this is the right-wing view. But to classify people as left-wing people and right-wing people, it becomes very misleading, because it's possible to be quite right-wing in your thinking on education. Young children need solid boundaries, clear standards and discipline to set them up for life. And yet be very left-wing politically, or left-wing in terms of your economic ideas. In other words, it's much more complicated than just being two types of people. And even if you take one of those things, like, politically, right-wing, left-wing, right-wing people don't all want to send people to the gas ovens and commit genocide. And left-wing people don't all think that the workers must rule the whole world. There's a whole spectrum in between. And I think I argue that this is another example where thinking in terms of directions rather than categories is much more wholesome. Right-wing, left-wing are very clear, different directions, but they're not clear as categories, except in very limited circumstances. And so if I go back to my original daft statement, two types of magicians, those who want to make life less interesting and those who want to make life more interesting. Of course, we're really, again, talking about two directions, and the two things are quite mixed up. So, for example, if you do want to do results magic and make a change for your benefit, you're poor and you want to become richer, very often the process is helped if you first go into your situation more thoroughly. If you get to know the demon that is keeping you in poverty and form a relationship with it, very often that helps towards the process of solving the problem. This is very clear to me in the Abramelin operation, where I suppose ultimately you do it for the intention of becoming more powerful for, those last 2 weeks when you meet all the demons and learn to do the spells. But the first 6 months is actually when you find out how unprepared you are. That is where it really rubs your nose in life and life's problems. And that to me was actually the bigger value. That was the real learning experience. So that was really what I have pulled out of that one daft statement: two types of magicians, those who want to make life more interesting and want to make life less interesting. Not a useful distinction, but perhaps if you think in terms of two directions you can face in, quite a useful direction finder for your magical path.